So hi everyone who decided to join us. Um, the lecture is called Power in World Politics, and we're going to be talking about relations of power and how power is understood in international relations. Now, before we start, a bit about me. My name is Philip. I come from Slovenia, and this is my first time helping out in GTS. So most of you probably haven't seen me or heard about me before. I study in the UK at the University of Cambridge, and I study human, social, and political sciences with an emphasis on politics and international relations. And this is probably why most of the lectures that I will be giving here, most of the recorded ones and the live ones will be centered around things talking about politics, talking about international relations, different aspects of it, and all of them are probably structured or should be structured in the way where they will help you understand international relations better. They will help you possibly debate international relations topics better, because in a lot of cases, especially here at home, debaters struggle with international relations, with concepts that can get pretty abstract, especially at the high school level. So this is just to give you some kind of aid to help you understand some level or like some aspects of the global society better. And today, the aspect that we're choosing to delve into is power and how power is actually exercised. So let's get right in. Okay, so the questions that I want you to think about at the beginning before I start, lecturing about different kinds of power and how power is exercised and so on, is the questions that are on the left. So go ahead and maybe stop this and read the questions, have a minute or two to think about them by yourselves. And then at the end of the lecture, maybe come back to these questions and see if there's anything more that you can add to your answers, the initial answers that you are creating. So just to read them out, firstly, it will be a question of what is power, how do you understand power, what is the criteria for which you say that an actor is powerful or an actor is weak. Secondly, can power be accumulated? So can it be stored somewhere? Can you have a set amount of, let's say, units of power, or is it always relational? Is it always only exercised in relation, in like international relations, when states act or other kind of actors interact between each other? Lastly, perhaps the kind of most interesting question for our debate related purposes, who are the most important and who are the most powerful actors right now, and why? At the beginning of this lecture, I really want you to think why you think that those actors are the most powerful, right? What is the kind of, what capabilities do they have? What kind of power do they have that you think that they can be deemed powerful? Okay, so the general outline of this lecture and how it will look like, I'll go through the typology of power, which I think are the three main facets of power that are most useful for debating. I'm leaving out some other that you can find in theory, in different thinkers of international relations, but I don't think that those are as important for debate or as applicable to debate, and it's probably just would serve to confuse you and so on. And at the end of this lecture, you will also have a drill where you will be tasked with trying to use this knowledge with giving me some answers. Okay. So let's start with compulsory power, right? So compulsory power is probably the type of power which most people or most people that are not really into politics or into international relations, people that don't care that much about theory, think that this is kind of the main facet of power that is very intuitive to everyone. It could also be called raw power, right? So the main kind of idea behind this power is for us to be able to get actors to do what we want directly through coercing them, through threatening them, and so on, right? So examples of that would include states threatening other states with their military power, threatening to invade them or attack them, and if they don't do something, right? So these were probably most pronounced in the previous early parts of human history. Now, after, let's say, the end of the Second World War, or rather after the end of the Cold War, the amount of states or the frequency of states exercising this kind of power has lessened dramatically. However, if we really want to look for it, we can still find it. Okay. So other than military threats, other than like the simple sheer amount of missiles that the country can threaten another country with, there's also the economic pressures, right? Because we all know that a state's incentive or a state's priorities isn't only to preserve, the lives and safety of its citizens, it's also to preserve its economic stability. And economic pressures are really pronounced even today in today's world when it comes to, for example, sanctioning being one of the main mechanisms that states aim to influence each other, in which they aim to signal to each other that they do approve or do not approve of certain behavior, right? So this can go both ways. It can be like positive or negative economic pressuring, either through subsidies and economic trade agreements. That would be like positive economic pressuring, whereas sanctioning and embargoes, trade restrictions, all of those things would come under the umbrella of negative economic pressures. All right, so lastly, it's not necessarily about material costs, right? It's not necessarily just about raw force and crude power in the shape of missiles and in the shape of money. It's also social pressures, things like shaming. Increasingly, when states have the power to kind of be the ideological leaders of the global society, when they are looked up towards by other actors, when they have some kind of power that we would otherwise call legitimacy, then we can say that they wield an extent of social power, and they can exercise some level of social pressures as well, right? A brief interruption there. My apologies for that. So yes, when it comes to social pressures, things like shaming, right? So states don't necessarily care about direct pressures such as military and economic pressures. They also care about how they are perceived by other actors, if they are perceived as being good or bad actors, if they are perceived as actors that we should not generally engage with. Although this is connected in the end, or you can make a kind of materialistic connection between a state being shamed and a state losing access to economic capabilities, such as it's, for example, less likely for them to be able to strike good trade deals with their partners because they are in generally shunned and shamed by the international community. It's also the fact that states in general by themselves don't like it intrinsically to be shamed and to be seen as actors that aren't good or don't have the best relations with others. So this is a facet that is most in international relations theory, the strand of theory that is most likely to talk about these kind of pressures is constructivism. And I'm also going to be having a lecture. I think it will be a live lecture about it. So if you want to hear more about that, about how non-material social pressures actually work and what states do to react to them, you're welcome to join there. Okay, so let's move on to the second type of power that can be exercised, which is institutional power. So institutional power, as we all know, the relations between states and actors in the global society, in the world, don't only happen on bilateral terms. So it's not just one state talking to another, it's also states forming and creating different kinds of institutions, different kinds of organizations, right? So institutional power is a framework that helps us understand the power that states actually wield or the inside of these institutions. So it is very unlikely that any kind of international institution is actually made in a way where all members would be equal and all members would have the same say. Although that might be true on a level of formality, on a level of, we sometimes call it sovereign equality, where, for example, each state would have one vote, for example, in the decision-making bodies of certain institutions. There's still a large level of institutional power that kind of circumvents these formal equalities, and that can be analyzed. So a way of an understanding, or a fancy way of understanding institutional power and what that actually is the indirect control over the conditions of action of distant others. Now, what does that actually mean, right? So we know that states in general without institutions tend to be pretty free and pretty unconstrained in their actions. By entering institutions and by choosing to enter into agreements, into trade pacts, they are necessarily like giving away some level of their autonomy in order to garner some level of benefits from those institutions, right? So for example, by engaging in trade pacts or trade agreements, you are obligating yourself. A state is putting an obligation on itself that it will abide by some laws, but because of those laws, it will also probably be able to access better markets or cheaper goods from some other people, right? So this is what is called like an indirect control over the conditions of action of distant others, because the conditions of action, meaning the constraints of our action, the framework in which our action can actually be taken, are shaped by the institutions in which these states actually partake in, right? So if a state decides to, let's say, sign an agreement or ratify a treaty on human rights, it is obligating itself, at least to an extent, to respect that treaty, to respect, let's say, human rights, not to torture prisoners and things like that. So it's the framework or the extent, the variety of its possible action gets limited. Now, the institutional power like paradigm tells us which states or that certain actors actually have more power in shaping how these institutions are created and shaping them in the way which benefits them, right? So some mechanisms in which states can actually influence that and through which this institutional power actually is exercised. For example, it is the creation of participation rules in institutions, right? So who gets to be inside an institution? So what is the criteria for membership? Is it only democratic countries? Is it only Western countries? Is it only countries in general, right? Because a lot of institutions or international organizations currently only accept states as members, but let's say discriminate against non-states, against corporations, against NGOs, which are, as we all know, also relevant actors within the international community. So simply by doing these setting these constraints to membership that seem maybe objective and maybe arbitrary at the beginning, you can start to see that these things are usually set intentionally in order to benefit the creators of such institutions. So the second mechanism might be the agenda setting. So what is actually talked about in these institutions? What is what is done daily? What is the daily routine that they are talking about? What kind of issues they're trying to solve, right? Lastly, it's about voting and voting rights. Now, although most institutions now have equal voting for sovereign states, which means that each sovereign state gets one vote, there's still many institutions, and I encourage you to research them, that have weighted voting on the basis of contribution towards a certain institution, right? So that might be that a state gets more votes depending on the financial donations that it makes, or depending on the personnel that it contributes towards the institution, whether it be soldiers or diplomats and so on. Now, one most famous example of institutional power that we can talk about is the power that is exercised by the UN Security Council, and namely, or more specifically, the P5 members, so the permanent 5 members within the UN Security Council. So if you don't know a lot about the UN has a lot of decision-making bodies that make decisions about a lot of different aspects of policy in the world, from economy to agriculture to human rights and so on. The Security Council is a body that mainly is tasked with the prevention of conflict and ensuring global stability by setting some rules, by sanctioning countries that are violating global stability, starting wars, and so on. So within UN Security Council, we have an unequal voting right. The P5, or the permanent 5 members, the members that are always in the UN Security Council, namely US, France, the UK, Russia, and China, those all have firstly, a permanent seat, which is not something that is granted to other members, but also they have a veto power. That means that they can strike down any and every resolution, any and everything that they try to implement in the UN Security Council. They can say that that won't happen because it is going against their interest. All other states that are not the P5 states only can vote and reach that decision, or to strike down a certain resolution democratically if the majority of the members also wish to do so. But the P5 members only need to vote themselves in order to strike something. So this is a clear example how countries can have institutional power or wield institutional power. These P5 members that I just that I named a bit ago, so they have much more power within the UN Security Council, and then consequently much more power in shaping what gets done and what gets decided about the global peace, security, and stability. Now, there's a lot of other examples of how states can abuse the power that they hold within institutions to actually abuse the global rules and kind of try to shape the global politics or economy in their own way. Also, pretty famous example might be the IMF or the World Bank, which is generally seen in political circles as a Western-led invention, or during the times of Cold War, or right after the Cold War, it was also possibly seen as an American-led invention, which mostly roamed around the world and tried to force certain states to conform to the norms and conditions that it set in order for them to be able to get money from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, right? So, and because the US simply had such a large role in it, or the Western countries had such a large role in it as well. It was seen that this was an extension of their power through institutions, which can be then thought about by institutional power. It's not necessarily that these countries that controlled or had the most say in the IMF or the World Bank always are countries that have the biggest military or the most money in general. It might just be countries that, for different reasons, maybe it's history, maybe it's culture, or cultural ties towards the founders, but simply those countries that end up having the decisive role within institutions. So whenever you're trying to research any kind of social or political relation for an IR motion, try to think about what institutions are relevant for that IR motion, for that relation, for the conflict. For example, if the debate is going to be talking about conflict, and think about what states wield the highest level of institutional power inside the institutions that are relevant for that conflict, because that opens up a whole new level of nuance within debates. Okay, let's take a small break before delving into the last type of power that I'm going to be talking about. So just stop listening for a while, pause this recording, take a power nap, go get some water, go get some air if it's not too hot, and then come back in a bit. And yeah, just remember to take care of yourself and your well-being. Okay, so I hope you're all back, and that you haven't left me yet. So let's just go on and talk about productive power. So by now, we've mostly been talking about power that could to an extent be traced back to material means, to either money or military power, right? Even institutional power to an extent is most likely only an extension of the economic capabilities of countries or the military capabilities of countries, which allows them to have a decisive role in creations of certain institutions, right? So productive power is similar, but is not as connected, it's not necessarily connected to relations of material power right now as it was ages ago, right? So productive power essentially means the power to create compelling narratives that then shape the way we think about the world, the way people are generally taught to view certain states, certain behavior, certain parts of the world, right? So the most pernicious, or perhaps the most kind of infamous example that is usually taught to IR scholars as the main exercise of productive power was during the time of conquest and during the time of colonization by Europeans, where this kind of discourse of European civility being juxtaposed against the others, the barbaric nations that need to be civilized, that need to be brought to the same living standard, the standard of civilization of Europe, right? So this was done mostly to legitimize European conquest and to bring it closer to some kind of moral ideals and to provide some kind of moral framework within which colonization and all of the horrible things that we know were happening during that time such as slavery, were actually trying to be legitimized by Europeans. But it's not necessarily just that. It's any kind of creations of truths that we are currently taking, or people were within history thinking about as necessary truth, but don't necessarily have a foundation in objective facts. So these are things such as what is socially desirable or what is not socially desirable, what is good, like productive behavior between states, and what is non-social or antisocial behavior between states. Human rights, for example, are one of the constructs that are heavily touched upon by productive power. So simply the fact that we have a level of standards of essential, standards of how humans should be treated, and the rights that are given to humans already means that that at some point people have decided that that these will be the main rights, and these are probably rights that were decided on by specific actors. So if we think about who were the actors that actually created these kind of frameworks, we can also see whether or not these frameworks might be flawed or not. So in a lot of cases, human rights have been criticized by many scholars by being Eurocentric or Western-centric, and that they do not adequately include all of the cultural nuances that happen in the world, that, let's say, enforcement, or if we try to enforce some kind of states being mindful of human rights, we will quickly get to the point where certain cultures or certain states are not as are not of the same mindset and do not think that the same kind of standards should be the most important ones or prevail over different kinds of standards, right? So human rights essentially give us a hierarchy of needs or a hierarchy of rights, in which the rights that are enshrined in the doctrine of human rights are the most important ones, and the other rights that are not enshrined within it, such as some cultures have the right to community and always living within the same village, things like that, are not enshrined in this and not codified in this law. So another version of productive power and how we can see it in the world is this idea of how societies should be organized. Scholars have at some point started to see that it is quite peculiar that any kind of new state that happens or is created ends up, even if it's not based in the West, even if it's a new decolonized country from, let's say, Africa, or a newly discovered country, or like polity within, let's say, Australia or Oceania, those kind of countries quickly adopt the same level of the same framework of politics as the rest of the world. So they quickly build the same kind of institutions, have the same kind of decision making done in parliaments, have the same kind of separation of power to executive, judicial, and legislative, and so on. And this is because the narrative that this is simply a template that should be reproduced in every single civilized country is so powerful, and is reproduced by simply every non-governmental organization or governmental organization that is trying to set up institutions within these new states, that is trying to usually under the guise of helping them, maybe even genuinely thinking that they're helping them, but in reality what they're doing is reproducing these kind of the same structures as we have in the rest of the world. Now, I'm not saying that this is necessarily bad, or this is like something that we should be normatively assessing as good or bad. I'm just saying that this is a clear example of how productive power is actually really important and really powerful and really relevant in shaping the lives of people around the world. So it's not the fact that a country actively forced a newly independent or newly set up state to set up the same kinds of institutions as were set up, for example, in the UK, in the United Kingdom. It's simply the fact that the power that was disseminated throughout organizations, international institutions, through non-governmental organizations, through the narratives and through the templates that were brought out by and reproduced by the rest of the world, were simply powerful enough to automatically transpose themselves into newly independent countries as well. So this template of how we should organize politics or society is actually another example in which productive power can be seen. Now, the impact of productive power, of course, in general, is legitimacy. And whenever you're talking about legitimacy and what is right and what is wrong and what is legitimate within international relations and within debates about international relations, you should always think about where this notion of legitimacy actually comes from. Because if legitimacy is sought to be something that is seen as correct by through international law or lawful, or is it simply something that is set by as a standard by international institutions? Regardless if it's codified or not, it comes from somewhere, and the source of this kind of norm, the source of this narrative can be questioned in regards to it, to how it was made, in regards to which actor, which character was in power when this kind of norm was produced. And you should also always perhaps then question what was the purpose of this norm when it was produced, and is it still really as relevant? Should we still normatively assess things in the same way as we did when this norm was established? Okay, so this would be the last kind of power that actors can actually wield in international relations in the global society. So we've been talking about compulsory power, which is the power to simply force other states to do what you want. Institutional power, the power that you have within international institutions to have your say, to shape the rules of engagement, the rules of membership, the rules of voting in a way where you indirectly have more power to influence the outcomes within these institutions. And then productive power, the power to create narratives, to create some kind of norms, to create myths and realities about what should and what should not be done, what is legitimate and what is not legitimate. Okay. Now, for the drill for this lecture, I have 3 tasks for you, and just read them all and then submit them to the tiny URL that is below. You should already be used to this by now, or so I'm told. So the first task would be to think of one recent example of compulsory power usage. So where could you see in the last year or 2 years or maybe 5 years at most that compulsory power was actually used by a certain state, either a threat or a sanction and so on, and it actually worked in influencing some other actor. This is so to help you understand that this is still a pretty relevant dynamic within the global community. The second one would be to find one international institution other than the UN, which I talked about, where one actor or a set of actors wields clear institutional power that is prevalent and that is dominating within that international institution. The third task is to think about the human rights and how you feel about human rights now that you know, or now that you have this framework of productive power through which you can think about the institution of human rights. Do you still think that they are relevant? Do you still think that we should support them or not? If so, yes. If not, why not? And submit whenever. So when you're done with those tasks, just submit them. Submit your answers to this tiny URL. Okay, so this was all for today's recorded lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you have a new perspective on power and about what power is and how it can be exercised in the global society, and that it helps you in your future debates. Okay, thanks for listening.